This review is for a mature rated game and discusses mature themes. Viewer discretion is advised. Where did Silent Hill 3 come from? Well, you see, when two games are loved by a number of people very, very much, then the development team do this thing, and out pops a sequel. Instead of doing something like Silent Hill 2, with a standalone story largely taking place in the same setting, Silent Hill 3 is more of a direct sequel to the first Silent Hill game, something that the development team were somewhat initially reluctant to do. But if it's a direct sequel, then what does this game do similarly or differently to before? Is it any good? Perhaps finding out the answers may not be a good or safe idea, but one can try in the third nightmarish vision of this psychological horror series. The first scene in an amusement park where teenager Heather has a nightmarish vision is only a precursor of things to come. After calling her father, Heather begins to leave a mall, only to be confronted by Detective Douglas Cartland, who claims to have information about her birth. Evading him leads Heather to discover the mall is abandoned, except for weird monsters. Then she runs into Claudia, a woman who has big plans that involve Heather. Considering the nightmarish reality that is the other world, and the dark past that involves the town Silent Hill, those plans definitely cannot be good. To an extent, the game's status as a direct sequel, not to mention its popularity, it is easy to essentially be spoiled on Heather's importance that is mostly a plot twist. It does also require knowledge of the first game's story, which is actually recapped in the game reasonably well, but anyone who's not played or experienced the first game might feel a little lost. Knowing all that, one may not be prepared for what is probably some of the most creepy and disturbing material in a Silent Hill game at this point. The story is somewhat lacking in some of the human psychology that made Silent Hill 2 compelling, but its themes of identity, maternity, femininity, growing up, revenge, the occult, and so on are deep, with subtle symbolism. This is especially evident in the use of blood that bleeds sometimes uncontrollably and everywhere in sections of the otherworld, with one room being notably horrifying. What is also notable is the characterization of Heather herself. Heather is just as much of an everyday character as the previous playable characters, but does get more development and has a sassy personality.
I am Claudia. So what?
The other characters are also generally well written too. These characters also look better than those in previous games did. This is an aspect of the presentation that, while not a massive overhaul from Silent Hill 2, is better and more consistent, owing to the whole game with its cutscenes and gameplay running on one engine. The graphics, with its lighting, including the flashlight sometimes being your only light source, colours and so on, are more than effective, especially with the dirty, decaying, blood-stained colour scheme of the otherworld. The sound is still probably the best aspect, as befitting previous games. The voice acting is good, most of the time, with some lines feeling like the writing is a struggle or that the actual voice acting is done on separate occasions with little to no context.
It gets to me, alright. I find it most fascinating. Wait! I'm not finished talking!
The soundtrack is somewhat different, with emotional rock tracks that seem to reflect well the teenage angst that Heather goes through. But the distorted tunes, and most notably the really quiet moments, and the droning sound effects make for an unsettling and even sickening atmosphere. A fair amount of it will be familiar to Silent Hill veterans, including the radio static that alerts you to monsters that are not necessarily in your immediate vicinity. The presence of monsters that are in your way is not necessarily anything new, which applies to a lot of the gameplay. This involves exploration, puzzles, and combat. As Heather, you explore mostly maze-like environments, which also include the aforementioned amusement park and mall that have a lot of locked or blocked-off doors, as well as its deadly otherworld equivalent. These environments are filled to the brim with enemies, as well as puzzles to solve, usually with key items that are lying around for Heather to find. Just like in Silent Hill 2, you can set the difficulties of both the combat and puzzles separately. In fact, if you go above the easy difficulty, you can accidentally fall into a bottomless pit. A first for the series. Anyway, let's talk about the combat first. First of all, Heather can carry a variety of weapons, most of which surprisingly don't really become obsolete and have their own uses. This especially applies to melee weapons, which are recommended to use in order to save ammo. Heather can also block most attacks and sidestep, which is made possible due to a somewhat better and smoother control scheme. Chain controls combined with disorienting camera angles still mostly apply here. In fact, this leads to combat sometimes being frustrating, depending on which monster you face. There are canine-like monsters that attack and run after you in packs. A beef jerky placed on the ground can distract them. Hey! Why are you going after me? I left some beef jerky on the ground. It's very yummy. There are quite a few big enemies too, which can make it hard to move around, sometimes leading to a swift melee attack knocking Heather back if you're not careful. The bosses are also very challenging, while also being generally instrumental to the story. While combat can be sometimes more frustrating than it ought to be, especially on hard, even for a horror game, the weapon variety and so on make for Silent Hill 3 contain what is probably the most engaging combat in the series thus far. So, the difficulty of combat can be adjusted to an appropriate level, and so can the puzzles. How tough these puzzles can be almost feels scary as well. It feels like the easy puzzles are easier than those of Silent Hill 2's easy puzzles, but on normal, and especially on hard, beware lots of scrutinizing over pattern recognition and complicated riddles. One puzzle on hard actually requires knowledge of William Shakespeare plays that the game doesn't even decide to teach you about outside of your real life homework and research. And it's the first main puzzle, so maybe easy or even normal are better. Outside of the exploration where you have to find key items that have to be put into specific places. Still, it seems to be the only way Heather can progress in finding out what's happening. Speaking of progression, Silent Hill 3 does have a few noticeable differences amongst its familiar gameplay elements. Remember in Silent Hill and Silent Hill 2 where you would sometimes wander around the title town looking for the next environment to go to? That doesn't really apply here anymore. The game is divided mostly into sections where the mall at the beginning leads to a subway which leads somewhere else and so on. That is largely how the game goes. You do go to the town towards the end of the game, and it's so foggy to the point of visibility being low, but it is generally small, with finding entrances to the sections of the game being easy enough. This can be appreciated by those who felt like the exploration of Silent Hill featured filler or padding, especially if you didn't really know where to go next. That being said, the game is short. Previous Silent Hill games were short, but this feels especially short, amounting to roughly 6 to 8 hours, especially if you get a good idea of what to do when exploring as thoroughly as you can, as well as check out some of the backstory or even Heather's observations. There aren't as many endings to unlock this time, which comes down more so to how much combat you do and with what equipment or items. This short length is alleviated by the possibility of replay value, with the selectable difficulty levels for combat and puzzles, plus the extra new game, unlockable weapons, and, for the first time in the series, costumes. You can unlock costumes through entering passwords that you find when fulfilling certain criteria, such as completing the game at least once, though you can look online and cheat. Silent Hill 3 ultimately does little to innovate or stand out from its predecessors. This can to an extent be a good thing because the first two games have a tendency to creep the player out and make them feel vulnerable, and question what is going on. Silent Hill 3 does that as well, with subtle differences. The progression from one place to another is an interesting change, the puzzles are very challenging, the combat, while sometimes frustrating, is engaging, and the story is compelling enough for what it is, regardless of the switch from mostly human psychology to religious overtones that are reminiscent of the first game. Silent Hill veterans will like this game, which does excel, with or without comparison, as a piece of psychological horror. If one does feel dread from hearing that radio static and encountering an enemy, or something far more horrifying that may elicit a visceral reaction, or even make the controller vibrate, or are you just imagining that? Then it is clear that Silent Hill 3 is a nightmarish and generally memorable horror game. Also, it's on the PS3 or Xbox 360 HD collection, but you should probably avoid that, so try and get the PS2 or maybe the PC version if you can. Now, you'd think after 3 visits to Silent Hill I'd know how to avoid being trapped, but there is the possibility of a creepy apartment room or something. I don't know for sure if I'll venture there. See you next October.